Okay, so we've already seen Aristotle arguing for political naturalism, which is the idea that political obligations are not things that you acquire through actions of your own from an initial state of freedom and equality. That's, we're going to see, is the assumption of the social contract theorists. Aristotle denies that. Aristotle famously says we're political animals. If you read Locke's two treatises of government, we're going to read the second one, which is the more famous one, shortly. A guy who comes up a lot, particularly in the first treatise of government, which is specifically a rebuttal of this guy, is Robert Filmer. And Robert Filmer was a contemporary of Hobbes, who wrote on various things and wrote some political pamphlets, and also wrote a work called Patriarcha, which he just circulated amongst his friends while he was alive, but in 1680 was published for the first time. He died in 1653. And that's when it first came to Locke's attention. And these years of Hobbes and Filmer and later Locke were turbulent years in England. Most famously, during this time, we had the English Civil War, which is when Oliver Cromwell defeated the king. The king was beheaded, King Charles I, and we were without a king for a while. It was when Parliament essentially took power. And this was a civil war, and like all civil wars, very bloody, very turbulent times for a country. The worst kind of wars for any country are civil wars because they pit families against families. Actually, before this was when Filmer was writing. We'll see that Hobbes's work is a reaction to the English Civil War. But Filmer was written before it. But the reason why Filmer's Patriarcha became so popular after his death was because it was used to bolster the royalist cause. Because Filmer is defending a version of a theory called the divine right of kings. Now, the divine right of kings is basically self-explanatory, the name. It suggests that kings don't rule because they're appointed or because they're invested in power by the people. They rule because God appointed them to rule. So again, it's a kind of version of political naturalism. There's no natural equality and no natural freedom. This is at the end of the Filmer readings. It summarizes Filmer gives 6 key theses of his, which are these. And one of them is that there's no natural freedom. You are not naturally free from political obligations. You're not naturally equal. Some people are born to rule, and some people are born to be ruled. Okay, why? Well, this is where Patriarcha is interesting, in that Filmer attempts a justification of this and an argument for this. And not many people did. It wasn't usually questioned. You know, it was just that God intends the kings to rule, so shut up and be ruled, peasants. But Patriarcha has both his positive theory, which I think to modern eyes is pretty silly, and even to eyes at the time. I mean, Locke regarded, both Hobbes and Locke regarded, I'm not sure Hobbes read Filmer because he died before Patriarcha was published, but was probably aware of similar views. But Locke obviously did read Filmer and respond to it and regarded it as kind of stupid. But what's more interesting about Filmer is his raising of problems for alternatives to his view, most notably the social contract theories of Hobbes and Locke and later Rousseau. He points out pretty serious problems for a theory that assumes that we are born naturally free and equal. But first of all, let's look briefly at his positive theory. So the key sort of girder, the rock on which he builds his theory, is that the Bible is true. It's a true history of mankind. That is, so even today, fundamentalist Christians or less fundamentalist Christians, just Christians in general, who believe that the Bible is true, don't necessarily believe that the Bible is the source of all wisdom about everything. Okay, but that's essentially the theory that Filmer is operating on. That this isn't just a book that tells, that tells the story of Jesus or whatever. It's in the Bible you can find the answers, the true history of humankind, and explanations of what God wants for us in all things. So, in the Bible, of course, it says that God created Adam first. And, well, actually, in Genesis, there are two stories, and in one of them, God creates Adam and Eve at the same time. In the other one, God creates Adam and later makes Eve. Apparently, it's not really out of his rib. That's a mistranslation, but that's the version we're most familiar with, that God takes Adam's rib and makes Eve out of it. So, Filmer says there's a reason that God made just one human being first, because God, of course, could have made, all of us at once. He could have made a whole thriving ecosystem, and presumably he did that with the animals. I don't know. But the fact is, God made Adam first, and then only later made any other humans. And Filmer says this is very important. Adam is primary in not just the sense in which he was the first person to be made in time, but he's the first and most important person. God gives the entire earth to Adam. So in this case, Adam rules over the entire earth and owns the entire earth and every creature in it. So Adam is not just the first human, Adam is the first king. Okay. So a couple of important points to take from this. One, a point about political authority. Political authority is monarchical. That is, you have a single king. And the second point is about property. Property is private. So we'll see in later social contract theorists the idea that before society is formed, either there is no property or property is communal, the idea that God gives the world in common to all humans. Filmer explicitly rejects that. All property is private. The entire world belongs to one person, belongs to Adam. And Adam can do with that property as he wills. So the only way any other human can get property is if Adam gives it to them. So that means, of course, that all property belongs to the descendants of Adam. And furthermore, the descendants who are the eldest male in each generation. This is the idea of primogeniture. That is, firstborn gets all the stuff. So inherits all the stuff. Firstborn male. If you're the firstborn female, you don't count because there's a reason God made a single man first, because, men are more important, according to Filmer. So, from the Bible, from the fact that God creates Adam first, we take this idea that political power is invested by God into a single individual to be passed down as that single individual sees fit. So, the kings that rightfully rule in Filmer's time have to be the eldest children of a generation. Now, how would this work? Why wouldn't there be just one ruler of the whole earth? You know, the eldest son of each generation. Why are there lots of different kings? And there are many, many different kings in these times. If you ever read Grimm's fairy tales, they've got, you know, kingdoms all over the place. And this was a fairly early development because, as Filmer himself points out, in the story of the siege of Troy, told in the Iliad, there are 30 Greek kings that embark on the trip to go and lay siege to Troy. So even in Greece, small country now, there were 30 kingdoms. So how are there so many kings? Why isn't there just a single king of the world? Well, according to Filmer, this is to do with the story of Noah, because of course we start with Adam, but basically there's a reboot because everything goes so wrong that God decides to kill everybody off and start again with Noah, or Noah and his family. So in the story of Noah, Noah officially now owns the entire world just as Adam did, because everybody else has been killed off. But he divides it up and gives it to his sons. So he has split by his own free choice, he has given property. While still alive, he has given some of his property to his children, and that's something you can do. You can, while still alive, you can divide up your property. This is the story of King Lear, so it can go wrong if you're not careful. So that's how you get all these different kingdoms. A king gives away some of his kingdom to a child. But that's the way it goes, and it's naturally, you know, the younger children of Noah or the younger children of a king don't get anything unless the older child dies or for whatever reason. So it's divine right because God gave everything to Adam, and then in having invested all that in Adam, it's to do with the kings themselves. They decide what power goes where. So it's political power is monarchical, it's paternal, it's the father, it's absolute, that is, there are no checks on the power of the king. So even of course, in England, during Filmer's lifetime, there was a parliament, and the parliament the parliament regarded its position as a check on the power of the king, so that if the king violated the laws, the parliament could hold him to account. Filmer says, no, you can't do that, because his power is absolute, which means that you cannot have any other body invested with power against the king, because then it's not really a monarchy. If any other body has powers to use against the king to hold him to account, then that is not really a monarchy. And there's no such things as aristocracy and democracy. He gives a separate argument for why you have to have a monarchy. He gives the main argument is that that's how it started. God created Adam. There's a second argument to do with will. That is, sovereignty, power, is an action of an individual. And you can only have power where there is a will to make laws, make choices. And wills can only be invested in a single person. He rejects the idea of a common will. You can't have a sort of body that has itself as a body a general will. That just doesn't make sense according to Filmer. Wills have to be the wills and choices of individuals. So you can't have aristocracy or democracy. It just doesn't even make sense because they don't have the kind of will that you require for sovereignty, for the power of the supreme leader. Also, there's no such thing as tyranny. Tyranny, now, he sort of qualifies this. He does admit that there have been bad leaders. So, yeah, actually, we should say at this point, God does give power to Adam and to all kings by implication, with qualifications that it has to be for the good of his subjects. So it's not like God says, you know, do what you want with the people. You can kill them, you can abuse them, whatever you want, it's up to you. No, God did intend for Adam to care for his children, and just as fathers are determined by God to care for their children, that is their job. So kings have to care for their subjects. So this isn't a license to do what you will. It does say that the person who makes all the decisions, the person who decides everything, is the king, and nobody else can tell the king that he's wrong. But at the same time, if the king is abusive to his subjects, he has violated God's requirement for him, and he will be punished. But it's not up to humans to decide that he's done that. It's up to God. So no human body can say, that's it, the king has violated his duty to look after his subjects, therefore he must be deposed. Oh, no, 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 you can't do that. That's God's job. So presumably when he says no tyranny, he means nobody is ever in a position to call a king a tyrant and do something about it. Because tyrants, in theory, should be deposed. But a tyrant is somebody who has violated some law that it is up to humans to judge whether or not they violated it. And there's no such thing. The only law that a king can violate is the law of God. All other laws, all human laws, the king can violate them as much as he wants because he is above the law. So, again, you should be familiar with the idea in America that nobody is above the law, at least we hope so, although the current Supreme Court seems to have its doubts. But that is not an idea that Filmer has. Any laws are basically, ultimately, from the king, and the king can violate them if he wants, because they're basically choices by him, and he can make a new choice. He can choose, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Now, this is extreme even for the time Filmer is writing, because the kings from the time of the Magna Carta were being held to account by bodies of aristocratic bodies, and the king supposedly had to swear on his ascension to the throne to uphold the laws of the land. Filmer says, well, not really. He doesn't really have to. They're just his decisions. And finally, no natural freedom. That basically is the fundamental point he's making. Okay, so there are some problems for this theory. So, for example, if the power, so essentially, Filmer's theory is cruder than Aristotle's, because Aristotle also says that the power of rulers is natural, but he very explicitly distinguishes the power of a ruler from the power of a father. Aristotle does say that men naturally rule over women and that fathers naturally rule over their parents, but that this is a different kind of power from the power a ruler has over his subjects. So, for example, you wouldn't necessarily assume that everything that is true of the power that a father has over his children is true of the power that a parent has, a ruler has over his subjects. Filmer disagrees. Filmer says they're literally one and the same. That the entire humankind is a family and a series of fathers within the extended family, because we're all descended from the same individual, Adam. Well, in that case, how do you reconcile the fact that we believe that fathers naturally have authority over their children, but it's the king is also the father? So who's the father of the children? Is it the king, or is it the father? And essentially, Filmer's response is, well, the king is the primary one. So the power that fathers have over their own children is just because the king allows that. But when the children become of age, reach like 18 or whatever, then they're no longer directly under the thumb of their parents. They should respect their father, but their father can't tell them what to do anymore, whereas the king can. So essentially, the power that a father has over his own children is just because the king allows it. So in theory, Filmer is saying, essentially, the king could come along and take away your children. Aristotle wouldn't like that at all, because that was his criticism of Plato. Plato tried to make the Republic all one giant family, and Aristotle thought that would lead to instability, because if there's one thing that parents care about, it's their own children, and if the government tries to undermine the sort of nuclear family, then that will lead to instability. But so that seems to be a problem, a criticism that Aristotle would have of Filmer's version. And also, what happens when the king in a particular country dies without a male heir? What do we do? How do we settle who gets to rule now? And Filmer's answer to that is a bit of a problem for him, because it sounds an awful lot like aristocracy. Because what happens then is that power devolves to the heads of the most important families, and as a body, they decide on who's going to be the next king. Well, that sounds an awful lot like aristocracy, that power devolves to an aristocracy. Now, he denies that that's really aristocracy, because it's just a one-off. They don't get to rule, they just get to settle the issue of who is the next king. But, it's a problem. And also, Locke, of course, points out, but wait a minute. The kings that we have now, how do you know that they are actually legitimately the eldest sons, or tracing all the way back to Adam? There's been usurpation, there's been all these kinds of shenanigans all along the line. So even by your own theory, Filmer, a lot of the kings that we have don't actually have the right that you want to give them. Your theory is supposed to justify the monarchy that we actually have, but your theory says it should be in the hands of the eldest sons, and we don't know if the rulers we have are the actual ones. So there's kind of a problem there. More interesting is his criticism of competing views. So he says, okay, suppose I'm wrong, and suppose we are naturally free and equal, that we are born, as the Constitution says, you're born free and equal. Free from political obligation, you have no natural ruler, and equal in political power. Nobody is more powerful than you. Nobody has political authority over you. Suppose everybody is born that way. How do we move from that initial state to a state of government? Because Filmer is assuming that he either says, look, either you can never leave this state, which he calls anarchy. Anarchy is essentially having no legitimate ruler, no legitimate political authority. Either if you start in an initial state of anarchy, you can never leave it. Because how could you leave it? Well, he says it should require universal consent. Everybody alive should have to, if we're going to divide the world up into different organizations, it can't just be the people who want to bud off and form an organization by themselves. Say, come on, you guys, let's set up our own thing over here. By the rest of humanity, we're just going to go over here. Don't mind us. No, you can't do that. Everybody on earth has to agree with you doing that. So it can't just be the people who want to set up a new society that agree. It has to be everybody agree that you get to do that. So either you have to have universal consent, but if you're going to have universal consent, you still have the problem of who calls the assembly, who presides over the assembly. Even to make the decision, you have to have some kind of political organization, and how are you going to set that up? Or alternatively, if you think that it should be allowed, that people can just bud off from any system and go do their own thing, well then, why can't that happen at any time? Because after all, you are born free. So why can't a new generation, like a bunch of teens, decide, I'm going to go off and form a new society? So, you're born in America, you're born free. You don't have to stay in America. You could go and set up new communities all the time. So, in other words, if you start with anarchy, everything's going to devolve to anarchy very easily. Because not only do you need universal consent, do you need some kind of patriarchalism to establish new societies in the first place, you also have to have patriarchalism for those societies to persist. Because otherwise, every generation, the society is going to kind of devolve. Because unless the children are born into a political society, in other words, not naturally free, then they might go off and form a new society or decide to stop following their parents. So for a political society to persist, you're covertly assuming patriarchalism. So even if you think patriarchalism is a silly theory of the origin of political obligation, it's certainly a theory that most social contract theorists seem to rely on for the persistence of societies. They don't think that children can just decide, okay, I'm free and equal, I can leave. So that's the political point. Communism is to do with the point about property. So if you deny patriarchalism, then it seems like you're committed to a natural state of anarchy where nobody has political authority. You're also assuming a natural state of communism where there is no private property. But again, if you start with a natural state of communism, how does anybody come to rightfully own anything? If somebody says, well, I'm going to take this chunk of land, everybody has to agree for them to be able to own that. Now we'll see when we get to Locke that he takes this seriously and tries to come up with a theory of property that doesn't require universal consent. But otherwise, if you start with initial property, looks like you will never get private property. You will never be able to get past the first stage because you're never going to get universal consent. Everybody in the world isn't going to agree, okay, you get that. And anyway, who calls the assembly, who presides. So that's the powerful critique that Robert Filmer offers. His own theory seems pretty silly and has its own problems and doesn't seem to, even if it worked in theory, it doesn't seem like it would necessarily justify the practical, the actual monarchs that he wanted it to justify. And that was Filmer's goal. Filmer's goal was to be conservative, was to justify the status quo. And it seems like he came up with a theory that was too radical for his purposes because it didn't really justify the status quo, and he was a little bit embarrassed about that. Which is probably why he didn't publish Patriarchal in his lifetime. But he ends up justifying, even though the king's duty is to care for his subjects, there is no check on the king's power. Now, he did say things like, yes, but if you look back in history, actually, the worst governments are the ones where they're not monarchies. He looks at the Roman Republic. Of course, Julius Caesar was killed to maintain the republic, but then they had emperors anyway. And he said the empire was much better, much more beloved, much more stable, lasted much longer. Any instance, he says there's no instances in history of a stable, non-monarchical system larger than a city. Athens, of course, was a city-state. But even that, he said, look at what Athens did. It killed Socrates. It expelled its greatest subjects. It was a mess. The only successful, long-lasting political systems are monarchies, he says. Even if you have a king who violates his duty to look after his subjects, chances are the people he abuses are only the ones who come to his attention, who are going to be in his immediate circle. Those will be the ones that he executes and, who oppresses. The rest of society can just keep their head down and lead a life that is fairly free and unoppressed. Whereas, he says, in a popular government, like a democracy, it's much more likely to have people, because people regard themselves as part of the political system, they will take it upon themselves to oppress each other. And the kind of misery is much more widespread, seeps much farther out into households and into the population. So he says, even if if what you care about is how good your life is, tyrants, even if they existed, they just, there's only one man. There's only so much bad he can do to individuals. And if he doesn't devolve his power very much, you're going to be okay. Your life is going to be better than under a corrupted democracy or something like that. So it's an interesting point. I mean, you hear the phrase divine right of kings and you think ludicrous, and indeed, his positive theory does seem silly. But he asks some hard questions of any alternative. It's a real puzzle of how you get stable persistence of a political system if you're really committed to the idea that every person, every human being is born free and equal. That's got to be, even now, every new baby that comes into the world in the sphere of an existing political state is itself not part of the political state, because the only way, according to social contract theories, the only way you can acquire inequality, the way you can lose your natural equality and your natural freedom, is by the exercise of your natural freedom, by consenting. But of course you can't do that as a child. That's going to happen that's only going to happen when you come of age. But what do we do in the meantime? Oh, are they under the authority of their parents? Oh, so you're agreeing that there's a natural authority that parents have over their children. Well, why doesn't that lead you into my view of patriarchalism, says Robert Filmer. So that's the challenge that Filmer lays down for social contract theorists. And we will, from here on out, be looking at the ways they try to meet that kind of challenge.